I've been asked to say a few words about interpreting Donald Trump. The first thing I have to say is that I work in the English booth and therefore I don't have to interpret Donald Trump. So what I'm saying is just based on observation and some thoughts about what goes into the process of interpreting. When Trump came onto the scene as a candidate and then as president, I do remember talking to some of the colleagues who I work with saying, what do you do when he speaks with a very slang turn of phrase, when he starts one sentence and finishes another, if he uses rather vulgar words, how exactly do you render that in your language? Because of our training and because of our interpreting instincts, what we want to do is convey both the message and the intention behind the message to the very best of our ability. But might that be a slightly dishonest way of doing things? Not dishonest in our intention, but might it mean that the message received by the non-English speaker is not quite the same message that the English speaker is getting from a Trump speech? I've got an example which I think may be apocryphal, but there's talk that, I heard a story I should say, that one of these associations that we interpreters work for, and I'm talking several years ago now, they were looking for a new president. And there were some candidates, and one of the candidates was, for the sake of this story, an Italian. Now, this Italian man was apparently a bit of an idiot. But when he gave his speech to become president, it was rendered so well into French that he was elected. Now, I don't know if it's a true story, but it does illustrate what can happen, that the actual person is improved by the interpreter and perhaps people get the wrong impression. Trump has two ways of speaking, two ways of communicating with the world. First, there's his direct speech, when he's talking, when he's tweeting, and also there's how his speeches are reported. And you can also see his method of speaking in his body language. I think if you look at old footage of Trump from a number of years ago, his language was different. It was more fluent and he used a greater vocabulary. So it would be wrong to think that this is how he can speak, or is this the only way he can speak. I think we have to recognize that the way he has chosen to speak is so that he can talk directly to the people who give them their political support. This is not just by chance that he speaks in this way, that he uses the words that he uses. You can go on the internet now and find a number of people who have analysed his speeches, and they think that all of this is part of a very specific plan for political power. He uses certain words that mean a lot to his constituency. Now, he wouldn't be the first politician to do this. I can think back to Tony Blair when he was British Prime Minister. He speaks pretty well a standard English, but he wanted to show that he was a man of the people, so he started using the glottal stop, which is in south of England, what we call estuary English. Instead of saying bottle, you say bottle. The glottal stop, which is a slightly sort of more, I suppose you could say, working class way of speaking. And Tony Blair did this as well. I mean, people ribbed him for doing it, but so therefore, my point is that Trump isn't the first politician to try and appeal to a certain group of people within the electorate by language. This brings me on to some of the specifics, though, of Donald Trump. How do you render some of the words he says? What do you say when he says that Comey's a nut job? What do you say when he's not clear in what he's speaking, when he starts one sentence and finishes another? And what happens if you come from a culture where you don't really know? How do you say that he wants to grab women by the pussy? Now, even in English, that's kind of a shocking thing for a politician to be saying, but we know what he means. But how do you render that into Farsi, into Arabic, into Japanese, particularly if you come from a country and a culture where these are words that you can't reuse very easily. And indeed, it's not very easy in the English-speaking world, in my country. They have a thing called the watershed, which means that before 9 o'clock in the evening, there are certain phrases, certain vulgar language can't be broadcast because children might hear it. And how do you suddenly deal with that? It was like when he was recently referred to a number of countries as shithole countries. And the American media during the day was going through all sorts of contortions to avoid saying the word shithole. And you can kind of see the problems that they had. I think also that one of the problems that people have had with Donald Trump is that his language comes over as unstatesmanlike. We're not used to that kind of language from the head of what is still the most powerful country in the world. And therefore, interpreters and translators, well, interpreters in particular who are working from his live scripts, have had to really think hard about how best to deal with it. Just to some of the features that he uses in his language, in his use of language, I should say. As I think you will have noticed, he goes for very simple language, and it's always the same. There's always a problem. There's always a solution to that problem. He often refers to himself in the third person, and quite often when he's talking, he'll tell you that he's been phoned by lots of people giving his support. Of course, these people are never defined, and whether they really phoned him is left up to you to decide. But he has a specific method of speaking, which is to appeal to his political supporters, his natural support. As to how you actually deal with it, I can offer no advice. I really don't know how an interpreter deals with it. I think each of them has to decide for themselves what they're going to do. I think it would also depend on the cultural environment in which they're rendering that translation. And I would imagine if they're working on the television or the public broadcasting in their country, they would have to agree with the authorities of that broadcasting service exactly how they wish to translate it.